Morning Year 10, it's week 2 of this crazy isolation. I hope that you are all doing okay and not going to stir crazy yet. If you are only this week beginning or discovering these videos, please don't panic anybody about getting behind, or if you're not quite at my pace. I'm going to be doing a video every day just so we can plough on through this play, but I do appreciate that everyone's circumstances are different at home, so I don't want anyone to panic if you're not going at my pace, okay? It's just important that we're chipping away at this play, that you're doing a little bit a day, okay? But it is not worth getting stressed over it. So today we are going to summarise what Sheila did to Eva Smith. So we're going to see Sheila being interviewed by the inspector. We're going to explain how it develops your impression of her character. Now, Sheila's a really crucial character in this play for reasons that will become apparent by the end of the lesson. So I'd like you to recall from last week what we mean by bombastic. How is Mr. Burling presented as bombastic in his big speech? You can pause the video and answer that question. Then our new word today is to repent, okay? Which means to feel regret or remorse about a wrongdoing or sin. So again, think back to A Christmas Carol, this idea of repenting for your sins, wanting to be seeking redemption, okay? Like Scrooge obviously does. So why do you think Priestley shows Mr. Burling not repenting his actions? So why does Mr. Burling not seem to be concerned that he has committed a sin or that he has done something wrong? Okay, so again, pause the video, answer those questions. So, if someone is bombastic, then their speech is very overblown and over the top. What they say sounds important, but it's actually empty and hollow and means nothing. So Mr. Burling is presented as bombastic in his big speech because he goes on about things that the audience in 1946 would definitely know had happened. So he talks about labour strikes coming to nothing, he talks about the war never happening, the Titanic never sinking, talking about how the 1940s will be a time of peace and prosperity, when actually the audience would have known the complete opposite. So, you know, it may sound very impressive what he's saying, but it's got no substance. It means nothing. And of course, Priestley's intentions here is to make us dislike Mr. Burling. We're not meant to like him because he symbolises capitalism. So, why do you think Priestley shows Mr. Burling not repenting his actions? Well, simply because we are not supposed to like Mr. Burling. We're not supposed to like him because he represents capitalism. You know, he is unremorseful. He is not going to change his ways, and that makes us dislike him. So, we are going to continue reading the play. We are going to start off by looking at Sheila. So remember, Mr. Burling has just been interviewed by the inspector, and Sheila, who has been with her mum in the drawing room talking about girly things probably, has just entered. So gaily again, Sheila's happy. Sheila's got nothing to be upset about. What's this about streets? Noticing the inspector. Oh, sorry, I didn't know. Mummy sent me in to ask you why you didn't come along to the drawing room. So again, this idea of her calling her mother mummy, it's very childish. I'm trying to get that in focus a little bit more. There we go. Burling says, we shall be along in a minute now, just finishing. The inspector says, I'm afraid not. Now again, Burling abruptly, if you're abrupt, you're very sudden. There's nothing else, you know, I've just told you that. And again, notice the short sentences showing, you know, Mr. Burling, you know, he's annoyed. He's annoyed and angry because the police inspector isn't treating him with respect as he normally would. Now Sheila says, what's all this about? And Burling says, nothing to do with you, Sheila. Run along. Now that's incredibly patronising. You know, this is his adult daughter. Run along like you would to a little child. The inspector says, no, wait a minute, Miss Burling. Now, Burling's getting angry now because he's bringing Sheila into it and he doesn't understand why. Look here, Inspector, I call this uncalled for and officious. If you're officious, it's a bit like, I don't know, we might say a job's worth. Someone who is just... making themselves feel overly important through doing their job. I've half a mind to report you. I've told you all I know, and it doesn't seem to me very important. And now there isn't the slightest reason why my daughter should be dragged into this unpleasant business. So again, Sheila is very sheltered. You know, he doesn't view Sheila as someone who really needs to sort of know what's going on. He's happy to have her sheltered. Now Sheila comes further in. What business? What's happening? Inspector says impressively, so importantly, I'm a police inspector, Miss Burling. This afternoon a young woman drank some disinfectant and died after several hours of agony tonight in the infirmary. Oh, how horrible, says Sheila. So her reaction is sympathetic, like Eric. So we have here both Eric and Sheila, the younger generation, have an instantly more emotional reaction. They are horrified that someone could do this to themselves, unlike Mr. Burling and Gerald, who it doesn't seem to have an effect on them. Was it an accident? The inspector says no, she wanted to end her life. She felt she could not, or she couldn't go on any longer. So, you know, Eva Smith felt like that she had no other choice. Burling says, well, don't tell me that's because I discharged her from my employment nearly 2 years ago. And Eric says, that might have started it. So again, not obviously against his father, but we see subtly here Priestley showing us that Eric is agreeing with the inspector. Mr. Burling did start it. And Sheila says, did you, Dad? Burling says, yes, the girl had been causing trouble in the works. I was quite justified. So again, he does not repent. Let's look at our new vocabulary word. He doesn't feel remorse. He doesn't regret what he's done. And Gerald says, yes, I think you were. I know we'd have done the same thing. Don't look like that, Sheila. So Gerald is just as bad. As Mr. Burling. But it's interesting that Sheila doesn't approve. And note, Sheila's rather distressed. Sorry, it's just that I can't help thinking about this girl destroying herself so horribly. And I'd been so happy tonight. Oh, I wish you hadn't told me. Now this is interesting because it's showing how ignorant Sheila is. And at this point, she wants to be ignorant. Because if she's ignorant about the truth of society, then she can just stay in her own silly, little, frivolous, shallow bubble. Okay, so at the moment she wishes, you know, she could just stay ignorant, and she wishes the inspector hadn't told her. What was she like? Quite young? The inspector says yes, 24. And Sheila says pretty. Now again, this subtle misogyny. If she was talking about a man, she wouldn't ask if he was attractive or handsome. It's this idea that a woman's only value is in their appearance. And remember, Priestley was an advocate for women's rights. So this misogyny is exposing this misogyny is deliberate. The inspector says she wasn't pretty when I saw her today, but she had been pretty. Very pretty. Burling says that's enough of that. So Gerald says, and I don't really see that this inquiry gets you anywhere, Inspector. It's what happened to her since she left Mr. Burling's works that's important. And Burling says, obviously, I suggested that some time ago. And Gerald says, we can't help you there because we don't know. He looks at Gerald. Sorry, the inspector says slowly, are you sure you don't know? He looks at Gerald, then at Eric, and then at Sheila. So what we have here is foreshadowing that they know something. Okay, foreshadowing. This is foreshadowing that they know something. about Eva Smith. So Burling says, and are you suggesting now that one of them knows something about this girl? The inspector says yes. Burling says, you didn't come here just to see me then? The inspector says no. The other four exchange bewildered and rather perturbed glances, so they're concerned now. Now Burling, with a marked change of tone. So he's suddenly sort of ingratiating himself with the inspector, or he's trying to stop threatening him, because of course if the inspector has more evidence of wrongdoing, then he wants to try and get the inspector on his side. Well, of course, if I'd known that earlier, I wouldn't have called you officious and talked about reporting you. You understand that, don't you, Inspector? I thought that for some reason best known to yourself, you were making the most of this tiny bit of information I could give you. I'm sorry. This makes a difference. Are you sure of your facts? So, you know, what we have here is Mr. Burling backing down. And through doing that, he's giving the inspector power. The inspector says, some of them, yes. And Burling says, I can't think they can be of any great consequence. The inspector says, the girl's dead though. And Sheila says, what do you mean by saying that? You talk as if we were responsible. Now, any time you hear the word responsible or responsibility, it's one of the main things, along with social class. You know, Sheila, at this point in the play, can't understand how her and her family could be responsible for this girl's death. Now, Burling, cutting in, again, talks over Sheila. Just a minute, Sheila. Now, Inspector, perhaps you and I had better go talk this over quietly in a corner. But Sheila interrupts him, which is interesting. Why should you? He's finished with you. He says it's one of us now. And Burling says, yes, and I'm trying to settle it sensibly for you. Gerald says, well, there's nothing to settle as far as I'm concerned. I've never known an Eva Smith. Eric says, neither have I. Sheila says, was that her name, Eva Smith? Gerald says, yes. Sheila, I've never heard of it before. Gerald says, so where are you now, Inspector? He says, where I was before, Mr. Croft. I told you that, like a lot of these young women, she'd used more than one name. Okay, so she changes her name eventually. She was still Eva Smith when Mr. Burling sacked her for wanting 25 shillings a week instead of 22 and 6. So he's repeating what a tiny raise it was. So he's basically repeating how mean it was for Mr. Burling to not give them a raise. But after that, she stopped being Eva Smith. Perhaps she'd had enough of it. And Eric says, can't blame her. So again, he's sympathetic. And Sheila says to Burling, I think it was a mean thing to do. Perhaps that spoiled everything for her. Now again, this is interesting because she is also disagreeing with her father's actions, just like her brother. So we're already seeing a divide here between the older and the younger generation. The younger generation are much more sympathetic, both in the Eva Smith situation, but they're more sympathetic to us. We like them more. Perhaps that spoiled everything for her, which of course it did. And the Burling says, rubbish. So again, this idea of not repenting, not accepting responsibility. He says to the inspector, do you know what happened to this girl after she left my works? The inspector says, yes, she was out of work for the next 2 months. But both her parents were dead, so that she'd no home to go back to, and she hadn't been able to save much out of what Burling and Company had paid her. So that after 2 months, with no work, no money coming in, living in lodgings with no relatives to help her, few friends, lonely, half starved. She was feeling desperate. Now remember, this was before the welfare state. This was before benefits or any form of social security. So Eva Smith was completely desperate. What their wages were so low that even if they were able to save anything, it was not very much at all. So again, it's this idea of this huge financial inequality. So she would have been incredibly desperate. And Sheila says warmly, I should think so. It's a rotten shame. So again, Sheila, as much as someone like Sheila is, empathising with Eva Smith. The inspector says, there are a lot of young women living that sort of existence in every city and big town in this country, Miss Burling. If there weren't, the factories and warehouses wouldn't know where to look for cheap labour. Ask your father. So this is a really important line because it's a direct criticism of capitalism. He's saying to Sheila, well, if you're sorry for Eva Smith, realise that she is not alone. There are so many young women and men like her that lead exactly the same sort of existence. And the people to blame are the factory owners. Capitalism is to blame. Now Sheila says, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. Now I'm even going to draw a box around this because this is such an important line. Even before she's questioned, Sheila is showing, just like her brother, without realising it, a socialist attitude, which is quite extraordinary considering who her parents are. So Sheila is being made more likeable, again deliberately, by Priestley. The inspector says dryly, I've had that notion myself from time to time. So he agrees with Sheila. In fact, I've thought that it would do us all a bit of good if sometimes we try to put ourselves in the place of these young women, counting their pennies in their dingy little back bedrooms. So again, this is just a horrible commentary on society, really. We're really, really quick to judge people, but actually how much time do we spend actually trying to put ourselves in their shoes and empathising with them? Sheila says, yes, I expect it would. But what happened to her then? The inspector said she said what seemed to her a wonderful stroke of luck. She was taken on in a shop, and a good shop too, Millward's. So Millward's is like a posh department store. Okay? So somewhere that sells pretty clothes and shoes and things. Sheila says, Millward's, we go there. Some foreshadowing for you. In fact, I was there this afternoon, archly to Gerald, for your benefits. So again, misogyny. The misogyny is strong here in this play. Because, of course, Sheila wouldn't want to look pretty for her own benefit and her own sense of, worth. She has to look pretty because she's trying to attract a man. Gerald, smiling, says, good. Sort of makes you want to, I don't know, tell him off there. But anyway, Sheila says, yes, she was lucky to get taken on at Millward's, and she was. A shop assistant in somewhere like Millward's would almost be more of a lower middle class job, really. So she was incredibly lucky. And imagine going from working in a horrible factory to working in a shop. And yes, you'd have to deal with, women like Sheila and Mrs. Burling who would be snobs and look down on you. But actually, how much more wonderful to be working with pretty clothes. Her herself would, have to be smartly dressed. It would be an absolutely incredible opportunity for Eva Smith. And the inspector says that's what she thought. It had happened that at the beginning of December that year, 1910, there was a good deal of influenza about. Now, influenza is the flu. Okay? which obviously was far more dangerous in these times than it was nowadays, although it's all very ironic when you think about what's going on at the moment. Anyway, there was a good deal of influenza about, and Millward suddenly found themselves short-handed. So she was very lucky. It was only because it was very hard to find decent employees because so many people were ill. So that gave her a chance. It seems she liked working there. It was a nice change from a factory. She enjoyed being among pretty clothes, I've no doubt. And now she felt she was making a good, fresh start. You can imagine how she felt. So it's really important, you know, that we understand this was a wonderful, fresh start. It was something much better. It was something much better than working in the factory. So Sheila says, yes, of course. And Berling says, and she got herself into trouble there, I suppose. So notice Mr. Berling just thinking the worst of her all the time. You know, if something happened, it of course would have to be Eva Smith's fault. The inspector says after a couple of months, just when she felt she was settling down nicely, they told her she'd have to go. So she was randomly fired. And Berling says, not doing her work properly. So again, he's automatically thinking the worst of her. The inspector said there was nothing wrong with the way she was doing her work. They admitted that. But Berling says there must have been something wrong. Notice how Sheila's been quiet this whole time. The inspector says all she knew was that a customer complained about her, and so she had to go. Sheila stares at him, agitated. So again, the foreshadowing, if we haven't already worked it out, that customer that complained was Sheila. So Sheila, agitated, says, when was this? The inspector says the end of January last year. So you might want to write in your books or your piece of paper, you know, this timeline that we've got so far. So we've got she was sacked from Mr. Berling's in 1910 from his factory. In December 1910, she started working at Millward's. But in January 1911, that is when Sheila got her fired. So she was barely there, you know, a month. Sheila says, what did this girl look like? The inspector says, if you come here, I'll show you. He moves nearer a light, perhaps a standard lamp. She crosses to him. He produces the photograph. She looks at it closely, recognises it with a little cry, gives a half-stifled sob, and then runs out. Now this is really interesting because she has an emotional reaction. So that tells us she obviously repents her actions. The inspector puts the photograph back in his pocket and stares speculatively after her. So he's interested in her reaction. The other three stare in amazement for the moment. Berling says, what's the matter with her? Eric replies, she recognised her from the photograph, didn't she? The inspector says, yes. Berling says angrily, why the devil do you want to go upsetting the child like that? And again, that's how he views Sheila. The inspector says, I didn't do it. She's upsetting herself, which of course she is, because it's her, you know, she's facing the consequences of her actions. That's what he means there. You know, Sheila's facing the consequences. And, you know, that consequence is guilt and remorse. Berling says, well, why? Why? The inspector says, I don't know yet. That's something I have to find out. Berling's still angry. He says, well, if you don't mind, I'll find out first. So he wants to go after Sheila. Gerald says, shall I go to her? Shall I go after her? And Berling, moving, says, no, leave this to me. I must have a word with my wife. Tell her what's happening. He turns at the door and stares at the inspector angrily. We were having a nice family celebration tonight, and a nasty mess you've made of it now, haven't you? Oh, so that wasn't very accurate highlighting. So he still doesn't care about Eva Smith. You know, he is not bothered. And the inspector responds, that's more or less what I was thinking earlier tonight when I was in the infirmary looking at what was left of Eva Smith. A nice little promising life there, I thought, and a nasty mess somebody's made of it. So again, the inspector's sort of replying, you know, this is your fault. Again, this is the Burlings, as a collective, responsibility to atone, to make up, to repent what they've done. Burling looks as if he's about to make some retort, then thinks better of it, again showing the inspector has the power here, and goes out, closing the door sharply behind him. Gerald and Eric exchange uneasy glances. The inspector ignores them. Gerald says, I'd like to have a look at that photograph now, Inspector. It's interesting, isn't it? What is Gerald feeling guilty about? What is he wanting to see the photograph for? Almost done. Another couple of pages. I know it's a lot that we're annotating today. The inspector says, all in good time. Gerald says, I don't see why, but the inspector cutting in massively. So again, he's not intimidated by the aristocrat. You heard what I said before, Mr. Croft. One line of inquiry at a time. Otherwise, we'll all be talking at once and won't know where we are. If you've anything to tell me, you'll have an opportunity of doing it soon. So again, Gerald rather uneasily, well, I don't suppose I have. Eric suddenly bursting out. So he's getting very worried and very emotional. I'm sorry, but you see, we were having a little party and I've had a few drinks, including a rather lot of champagne, and I've got a headache. And as I'm only in the way here, I think I'd better turn in. So he wants to go to bed. The inspector says, and I think you'd better stay here. Eric says, why should I? The inspector replies, it might be less trouble. If you turn in, you might have to turn out again soon. Gerald says, getting a bit heavy-handed, aren't you, Inspector? So he's like, you know, why are you talking to us like this? The inspector says, possibly, but if you're easy with me, I'm easy with you. And Gerald says, after all, you know, we're respectable citizens and not criminals. And the inspector says, sometimes there isn't as much difference as you think. Often, if it was left to me, I wouldn't know where to draw the line. So again, another really important quote. It's a socialist view. You know, this idea that just because you're rich, it means you're a good person is complete nonsense. Sorry, that's like the worst drawn box ever. Gerald says, fortunately, it isn't left to you, is it? And the inspector says, no, it isn't, but some things are left to me. Inquiries of this sort, for instance. So Sheila comes back now, looking as if she's been crying. So again, we can see here that she feels guilt and remorse. The inspector says, well, Miss Burling, Sheila coming in and closing the door, you knew it was me all the time, didn't you? The inspector says, I had an idea it might be from something the girl herself wrote. Sheila says, I've told my father. He didn't seem to think it amounted to much, but I felt rotten about it at the time, and now I feel a lot worse. Did it make a difference? Did it make much difference to her? You know, again, she is accepting her responsibility. Completely unlike her father. And the inspector says, yes, I'm afraid it did. It was the last real steady job she had. When she lost it, for no reason she could discover, she decided that she might as well try another kind of life. Now think about it. If you're a poor woman, what's one of the only jobs you could do if you didn't want to starve? Can't spell prostitution. There we go. Okay, so Sheila firing her for no reason was the last proper job Eva Smith had. Sheila says miserably, so I'm really responsible. The inspector says no, not entirely. A good deal happened to her after that, so there's still a lot more to the story. But you're partly to blame, just as your father is. Eric says, but what did Sheila do? Sheila, distressed. I went to the manager at Millwards and I told him that if they didn't get rid of that girl, I'd never go near the place again, and I'd persuade Mother to close our account with them. So she's using her status, or her father's status, to blackmail them, basically. The inspector says, and why did you do that? Sheila says, because I was in a furious temper. And what had this girl done to make you lose your temper? Sheila says, when I was looking at myself in the mirror, I caught sight of her smiling at the assistant. I was furious with her. I'd been in a bad temper anyhow. So literally, she thinks Eva Smith is mocking her. And again, thinks. She doesn't even know. That's her interpretation. She'd been in a bad mood anyhow. The inspector says, and was it the girl's fault? Sheila says, no, not really. It was my own fault. Says suddenly to Gerald, all right, Gerald, you needn't look at me like that. At least I'm trying to tell the truth. I expect you've done things you're ashamed of too. More foreshadowing. Gerald, surprised, says, well, I never said I hadn't. I don't see why. The inspector, cutting in, interrupting him. Never mind about that. You can settle that between you afterwards. Says to Sheila, what happened? I'd gone in to try something on. So she'd gone to try on a dress. It was an idea of my own. Mother had been against it, and so had the assistant, but I insisted. As soon as I tried it on, I knew they'd been right. It just didn't suit me at all. So this is all over a dress. I looked silly in the thing. Well, this girl had brought the dress up from the workroom, and when the assistant, Miss Frances, had asked us something about it, this girl, to show us what she meant, had held the dress up as if she was wearing it. And it just suited her. She was the right type for it, just as I was the wrong type. She was very pretty too, with big dark eyes, and that didn't make it any better. Well, when I tried the thing on and looked at myself and knew it was all wrong, I caught sight of this girl smiling at Miss Frances, as if to say, doesn't she look awful? And I was absolutely furious. I was very rude to both of them. And then I went to the manager and told him that this girl had been very impertinent, and impertinent means rude. She almost breaks down, but just controls herself. How could I know what would happen afterwards? So again, she's ignorant. She had no idea. She didn't even think for 1 second the impact that would have on Eva Smith, because she's ignorant. If she'd been some miserable, plain little creature, I don't suppose I'd have done it. But she was very pretty and looked as if she could take care of herself. I couldn't be sorry for her. So Sheila literally makes Eva Smith lose this amazing opportunity because she felt bad about herself. She felt like a fool wearing this dress she looked horrible in, and basically took her frustrations out on Eva Smith because Eva Smith was poor and Sheila's rich, and she knew that she could do it and get away with it. And what's worse is that she used her status to get rid of her and to sort of blackmail Millwards. And because Eva Smith was attractive, she thought that meant that she'd be fine and would be able to look after herself, which again comes back to Sheila's ignorance. You know, the whole thing was very spiteful, very immature. And as the inspector says, in fact, in a kind of way, you might be said to have been jealous of her. And Sheila says, yes, I suppose so. And the inspector says, and so you used the power you had as a daughter of a good customer and also of a man well known in the town to punish the girl just because she made you feel like that. And Sheila says, yes, but it didn't seem to be anything very terrible at the time, don't you understand? And if I could help her now, I would. So again, we're coming back to the fact that she repents, unlike her father. The inspector says harshly, yes, but you can't. It's too late. She's dead. So again, you've got to live now with the consequences of your actions. Eric says, my God, it's a bit thick when you come to think of it. And Sheila says stormily, oh, shut up, Eric. It's the only time I've ever done anything like that. And I'll never, never do it again to anybody. I've noticed them giving me a sort of look sometimes at Millwoods. I noticed it this afternoon, and I suppose some of them remember. I feel now I can never go there again. Oh, why had this to happen? So she's feeling sorry for herself here. Now this is really interesting because, you know, Sheila does undergo a transformation in this play, and we can see that we're already feeling, you know, more sympathy for her than we do Mr. Burling. But she hasn't undergone that transformation yet. She's still feeling sorry for herself that she's not going to be able to go into Millwoods and is embarrassed and feels bad. The inspector says sternly, that's what I asked myself tonight when I was looking at that dead girl. And then I said to myself, well, we'll try to understand why it had to happen. And that's why I'm here and why I'm not going until I know all that happened. Eva Smith lost her job with Burling Company because the strike failed and they were determined not to have another one. At last she found another job, under what name I don't know, in a big shop, and had to leave there because you were annoyed at yourself and passed the annoyance on to her. Now she had to try something else. So first she changed her name to Daisy Renton. And we're going to look there tomorrow. So I know that was a big old chunk that we annotated there, so well done for keeping up. So 2 little tasks that I'd like you to do now, that I would like you to email me or your class teacher. Summarise what Sheila did to Eva Smith. Explain how this develops your impression of her character. And why do you think Priestley that doesn't make any sense. Why does Priestley have Sheila repent her actions? So why make Sheila feel guilty and take responsibility and not her father? How could that link into Priestley's intentions? Okay, so well done if you made it to the end. Okay, get your annotations done, answer those questions, and then email them to your class teacher. I'm going to try, I've been experimenting with Zoom, which is like this conference calling software. So I'm going to try and see if we can do a live lesson at some point this week. Okay, but I will let you know via email all about that. Okay, any questions or concerns, as always, just give us an email. Okay, bye.